Let's talk about timing in life. Let's talk about timing, really, though, in fantasy football. We're going to talk on today's show about some players that are, it's better to be out a year or two early on, because in these situations, whether it's best ball, whether it's dynasty, if you're drafting these players or if you're holding them on your dynasty roster, your team will be in a worse position if they just drop off in value over the course of the season. But likewise, maybe there's some of these younger players that we shouldn't be giving up too early on. The breakout is still about to happen. So I am joined by Theo Gremminger of Fantasy Points. We are going to talk through some of those in a moment. But Theo, I always like to look ahead. I'll take no credit for this, but one of my favorite shows every year, Sean Siegel, Ben Gretsch on Stealing Bananas, they will project the first and second rounds for the following year's draft. So I'm sure it'll be coming up over the course of the next couple of months, and they'll be doing it again. But looking to the 2026 season at this point and looking at those players who kind of send up the boards, can, fall away, and what to do with them. And I think it gives you a real edge then when you're in your season-long drafts and looking at profiles of players who are going to have those smash seasons and be valued the following season, because the players who are valued the following year are going to be the players who have had the success the previous year. I think that tells its own story. But any philosophical thoughts on looking ahead to the future seasons?
No, I think that I always enjoy that one that Sean and Ben put out as well. I think it's great, and it's a way for us to sort of look and see values, and I think it's sort of a way to, if you're a dynasty player, it's a way that you can sort of exploit best ball and redraft ADPs. A lot of times the dynasty community might be getting out on a player a little bit earlier than the redraft managers, who are just hoping for one last big impressive year from a guy. NFL is one of the sports where guys don't necessarily lose 25% of their value. They can lose 100% of their value. So I'm completely with you. I like to be, I think sometimes, we're sometimes chasing youth a little bit too much, but I'd rather be a year early on a guy than a year late of getting out of them. And a lot of times the worst possible picks you can make in ADP are these veterans that just come completely crashing down in terms of production. Those are also the kind of players that an NFL team just has a younger player overtake in the depth chart too. So completely with you on sort of being forward thinking and trying to be a year ahead whenever possible.
Yeah, and I know it's the easy one to talk about now. We did talk about Bucky Irving a little bit on the last show, but when we look at the situation with Rashard White, like this time last year, we're talking about Bucky Irving, and it might be some optimism for the rookie draft community being like, this guy's going to come in and take Rashad White's role. But the downside for people who had Rashad White was he's coming off a season where he's not very efficient, but he's doing great numbers in the passing game, and then that all falls away. And now if you're looking at him in dynasty or in season long, like the value has decreased dramatically. So they're the kind of things that we're trying to go in and avoid with this particular segment of the show. I said later we'll be looking ahead to the guys who are still ready to break out. And that's one of the things, I like to try and play, in all formats. So you're playing in your dynasty league, you're in your rookie draft, so you're keeping up to date with all those players, and you're kind of seeing the profiles and who can break out and how their career is going and what the trajectory is. I do think that gives you an advantage then again, like when you go into your best ball drafts, where some people might be like, well, that guy was a rookie last year and he didn't hit, so he's rubbish. And that usually isn't the case, but it's also important to see if it is or isn't. And the player, like if I'm looking here and I'm talking about it's better to be out a year early, I'll hold my hands up. And like Saquon Barkley last year was somebody I didn't draft at all, but looking at the trajectory, and you're like, well, he might have a good season with the Eagles. A good season in my range of outcomes wasn't the season that he had in terms of the incredible run. Now, if you had moved out of him last year, obviously it's not looking quite good now, but you will also have that range of outcomes where somebody, kind of breaks the mold. I think a lot of the time, like a player was mentioned on the last show, was Travis Etienne. A lot of players who, start that descent in terms of their career slowing down or falling off, it's rare that it is, rebounded in the way that a Saquon had. And, I talked on the last show about the Breece Hall situation. Sometimes it's the situation you're in and the way that organization is setting you up for failure rather than success. And obviously we've seen what the Eagles set up in a much better way and able to have all the success and end up winning the Super Bowl last year. So when we look at the players who we're talking about being out a year too early, is there any players that you think their fantasy value is about to drop off a cliff here in 2024?
No, I think when we're looking at best ball and redraft as a whole, I think that a guy who has certainly lost a lot of value, but does he have potential for a bounce back and give you one last big season? Tyreek Hill has been a mixed message guy for a lot of people, and I think Tyreek Hill is a dangerous profile for us to go back in on and think that the 2024 season just doesn't matter so much. Obviously, there was the traffic incident where apparently he was hurt in. You also had the fact that Tua Tagovailoa missed so much time. The offense was changing. Devon Achane became this big pass catching weapon. But when I look at Tyreek Hill, it's just one where I put out an early top 25 at fantasy points, and I'm expanding it to a top 50. And these are redraft rankings. And I keep wanting to push Tyreek Hill lower and lower. And when I look at the disconnect between my rankings and what underdog drafters are doing, what FFPC drafters are doing, I just can't get there. So Tyreek Hill right now is priced as wide receiver 12. I just can't get there. I would rather take a chance on a DJ Moore at wide receiver 17, a Xavier Worthy at wide receiver 21. There's lower ranked players that I would rather have access to rounds later than taking a chance on a wide receiver at this age, bouncing back in a dramatic fashion. And that's not even to mention that I think Jaylen Waddle will bounce back a little bit this year. And Jonnu Smith, I don't think, is disappearing from this passing game. So I'd say for me, it's, even though it's a low-hanging fruit because of his age, Tyreek Hill is very much one where I'll let someone else draft him.
Yeah, Hill, like there's a lot of scenarios when we look at the Dolphins, even over the last 2 seasons, the quarterback health, there's been wrist injuries for Hill, but he also is now 31. And you used to talk about this a little bit with Tom Brady and how he prolonged his career, but players now are like, sports science has changed dramatically. So players are staying, in peak shape for longer. But Tyreek Hill is somebody who's like so reliant on his speed. Maybe he will keep that speed also till he's like 40 years old. But as he gets older, the likelihood of the injuries and things like that occur. And you have the quarterback situation where we hope it doesn't happen. But if Tua had another concussion this year, he's probably sit out for 8 games. And we've seen what was happening behind him then. A quarterback last year wasn't able to support the offense in any way. Some of the players here, if we look at the opening rounds of ADP, like second round, AJ Brown still in there. And, I'm not necessarily concerned all that much for his talent, but the way the offense ran through Barkley and Jalen Hurts last year really did hurt him in terms of his upside. But the other side of that is, if we're talking about, if, Tua gets injured, what if Saquon Barkley unfortunately picked up an injury this year and then it has to go through the passing game? We've seen at times when they did ask Hurts to pass, he was able to do that in a number of situations. When we look through, though, that range where you're talking about Tyreek Hill getting drafted, it's an interesting zone of like veteran players and players who have either not consistently done it or have been injured. When you look at the younger profiles, unless you get into the rookies. So like from Tyreek Hill, the wide receiver that's going above him in drafts is Garrett Wilson, then T. Higgins. Then you get Tyreek Hill, then you get Terry McLaurin. You mentioned DJ Moore, you have Marvin Harrison, Mike Evans, Devontae Adams, Xavier Worthy, then Rashee Rice coming back from his injury. Then we're down to Devontae Smith, Zay Flowers, Rome Odunze, Chris Godwin, then down to Ted McMillan, DK Metcalf. There's a lot of kind of names in there where it could be like pick your poison in terms of the young players ascending may still fail to do it. But when I'm looking at the players in that range, you mentioned Worthy, who is somebody I was in hugely on last season and came on in the Super Bowl, but the consistency just wasn't there with him and Mahomes throughout the season. But him or even Rice coming back from his injury, Zay Flowers, Devontae Smith, taking a shot on Rome Odunze, certainly Ted McMillan, all of those names would be much more for me ahead of Hill. And I'm just looking at the likes of, Mike Evans, Devontae Adams, those names, continue in their descent down. And it may be a little bit slower than we would talk about the wide receiver cliff when you get to, your late 20s than it was previously. But concerns with a lot of those wide receivers. Similarly, we talked on the previous show about the running back position and how they could be affected by the NFL draft. But is there any of them when you're looking at performance metrics, how they were used last year, that there's a large call for concern even outside of the NFL draft with them?
Well, I like when we put this into context of ADP, he's not a guy that I would bet on to be bad next year, and I don't think he's one that necessarily is going to cost you your draft. But when we're looking at the ADP price tag, Josh Jacobs at 25 overall feels very, very high. It feels very, very low upside. We talked a little bit about this in the previous show, but Jacobs was a guy that volume-wise, I think handled about all he could. And down the stretch, Green Bay just leaned into him, got away from the pass, went way more run heavy. And I think that was just the game plan. But I think that this offseason, there's going to be a lot of self-scouting in that building, looking back at what worked for Jordan Love in his first year as a starter, and Love last year struggling with the turnovers. But I think they're going to try to get back to a little bit more balance there. So for me, Jacobs just seems like a bad bet at 25 overall. Another veteran wide receiver that, I mean, I absolutely love Jayden Daniels, and I loved what Terry McLaurin did last year. But McLaurin at 26 overall, and I'm referencing FFPC, current ADP. I think we're probably about in the same boat, but I was referencing I was looking at the big gorilla, not the best ball, but they're about similar ADPs. McLaurin at 26 seems really, really high. He's a guy that was unbelievable last year in terms of touchdowns, but that's a harder stat for us to bank on year in, year out. They've already added Deebo Samuel. We think that Washington is going to add a running back that's going to command touches in the NFL draft. And I don't think they're done at wide receiver either. I know they've been a team that's sort of waiting in the wings, whether that's through the NFL draft, whether that's another cut candidate type veteran lands there. I just think with McLaurin, for him to return on that ADP, he's going to have to equal the touchdown catches, and that's a difficult narrative to kind of invest in.
Yeah, and these are all situations as well where we're kind of not necessarily we don't like to play. Like I like Terry McLaurin. I like his career story. He comes into the league, hits straight away. Has never really had a quarterback. Gets a quarterback this year. Has some success. The other part with McLaurin is like a lot of those plays this year. You think of the touchdown against the Dallas Cowboys at the very end of the game. Like not necessarily repeatable plays in terms of them happening this year, but early September, so 15th of September, basically week 1 of the season, turns 30 this year, and you're looking at, I mentioned like the age curves and things like that, but he's really been pushed up into that kind of late second, third round range, and a lot of concerns when I would have to think about drafting him at that particular spot. Looking through the running back, so you mentioned Jacobs, and I like to look at the gaps then between running back ADP. You mentioned in the last show like some hopes that Tootin may end up with the 49ers, and you're looking at Christian McCaffrey in the second round. The big gap ADPs in terms of where the backup is going, I feel like Josh Jacobs' backup is going to be going quite a bit later unless it's one of the higher profile names, and getting those guys in the double-digit rounds is going to be something that I'm trying to do. Now, people will long-time listeners to the show, even from the last 12 months, will say, well, last year you were drafting Will Shipley when, he was the backup to Saquon Barkley. You take these bets and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. We looked through it, and I've mentioned previously Alvin Kamara is somebody I think even in the 5th round I'm very concerned about, entering his age 30 season as well. Joe Mixon is somebody, who fits to me the Josh Jacobs situation last year, where he kind of overperformed expectations early in the year, and then the team decided they were going to lean on him because of any other concerns that they had throughout the course of the season. He's going to be 29 entering this year, but they also kind of, to their own detriment, continued to feed him the ball in key situations. And I know we had, quarterback issues with CJ Stroud and how they played, but they also have weakened their offensive line the course of the offseason. And again, hyping up that, arrival to Washington for whichever running back ends up in it, they are going to have that key piece in Laramie Tunsil from the offensive line now over there. But there's quite a few of those, like Joe Mixon will be really fitting into that for me in terms of the year too early. I did kind of briefly mention this on the end of the show when we were finishing up, but James Cook is currently going at the running back 14 spot. I have some concerns over how he was used last year. He was pretty extreme in terms of efficiency on the big plays and having successful fantasy days. But if you look back at the way they were using him and the amount of time he was on the field in terms of the snap share, I have some concerns about if they land somebody in there that's a little bit more talented than what they currently have, and how that backfield continues to shake out this year with him going, in that 3rd round range. Am I overstating the James Cook stuff, or have you any concerns about him this year?
The James Cook stuff is weird because he played a lower percentage of snaps than we'd like to see from our backs we're really leaning into, especially if you're going with some like a modified hero build or having him as a highly drafted RB2. like the lower snaps was just an odd kind of turn of events in Buffalo. And then the when we're talking about overall touches, James Cook, even if he's in the same role as he was last year, is not really a great bet to get into the top 15 in terms of running back touches. So it's a team that brings back Ty Johnson. They like Ty Johnson. And Ray Davis last year was very solid. Yeah. Ray Davis had some solid moments. So for me, I think when you factor that also in with the disconnect with the contract situation, there is a chance that we could see a James Cook holdout. And Buffalo's a team that has a ton of draft picks. This is a team where they might not draft a running back super early, but this is a team that could add somebody in that Ray Davis range that has just enough where it's going to be somebody who could cut in into Cook's touches. So Cook was another high-end touchdown guy. You know,
16 touchdowns on the ground.
Yeah, you referenced this last show with, you know, looking at some of these running backs who fall off and the guys who fade. You know, Cook was a very, very efficient, but touchdown regression is another metric where we can find guys that can lose some fantasy value. So I agree. Cook is just being drafted very, very highly when you factor all those things in, despite the, you know, second most touchdowns all time to OJ Simpson in Buffalo. People love looking at that. And he's also a younger player relatively. But I don't know, that contract situation seems like a mess right now, Colm.
Yeah, he had 18 total touchdowns last year, but he had 16 on the ground. He has 20 career total rushing touchdowns through 3 seasons. He had 16 of them last year. And the other thing that really concerned me, you mentioned, you know, Davis and Johnson there, and he had 54 targets in 2023, you know, 44 receptions on that, but went down to 38 targets last season. Like when it was passing downs, they were almost extensively taking him off the field, which, you know, when he's obviously healthy last season, it wasn't a case of injury concern. I felt very concerned to see them so willing to take him off in those situations and feel like the team doesn't see him as the, you know, that person who can be the 3 down back when they see the other 2 running backs as higher end upside on the receiving side of things. So let's get into the optimist in us rather than the pessimist. Is there any of these second or third year players who haven't fully hit yet? And Xavier Worthy probably would have fit at this if he didn't have 2 touchdowns in the Super Bowl. Somebody who I mentioned already was extremely high on last year, but any of the names where there has been flashes, and I've said second or third, you can expand it if you wish, but that we've seen, you know, those glimpses from, or maybe it was that they come in with the high draft capital. Maybe this is the question, like this can be the JSN award, you know, the players who it didn't fully come in until a couple of years down the line. Any players in that kind of profile that you think could be about to break out in 2025?
Well, I think the low-hanging fruit is the Rome Odunze. It's the JSN profile all over again. Rome Odunze, I do have some concerns because it was a total lack of production. I mean, we had 3 games that were fantasy relevant. For a player of that sort of draft capital to only produce a few times. Now, when he did, it looked fantastic, and it was great to see. But when we saw Keenan Allen out-targeting him for a large portion of the second half of last season, Keenan Allen at his age and sort of on his you know, minimal contract there, and he was still able to outproduce him and out-target him, that was a bit of a concern. I do think that there is a fresh slate, a clean slate with Ben Johnson, and also the fact that they've moved on from Allen shows that they have the confidence in Rome Odunze to take this next step. Problem is we're not getting that sort of discount with Odunze that we usually would have for a player with the complete lack of production. Like right now, I'm having to take Rome Odunze alongside of Ted McMillan. I'd rather go with Ted McMillan. I'm taking him ahead of Devonta Smith. I mean, I think Devonta Smith is a pretty safe bet at his sort of below wide receiver 2 range right now in ADP. So for me, like, you're kind of taking Odunze in that wide receiver sweet spot. I also think that Ricky Pearsall, there's a very good argument for Ricky Pearsall breaking out this year. And there we find a price tag that's a little bit easier to take. He's steamed up, but he's still going as a low-end wide receiver 2. We saw with Pearsall, he ended the season quite well, where some people take that into account and they love seeing end-of-year production. Some people say it doesn't really matter. One of those weeks was not even when we were playing fantasy. It was week 18. But it was back-to-back games to end the season for Pearsall. Pearsall has that explosiveness, the draft capital, that athleticism. And I think that there's an argument that does he become a manufactured touch guy with no Deebo Samuel there in a very different way? So Deebo Samuel had all the rush attempts. They're not going to do that with Pearsall, but do they find ways to get Pearsall the ball around the line of scrimmage and use his athleticism? That could sort of bode well for him to take this next step.
I find it interesting with Pearsall. Like, if we're just looking at ADP in the 8th round, wide receiver 41, and then we see Jaylen McLaurin, who kind of had a really strong second half to his rookie season. He's in round 10, wide receiver 49. So there is quite a gap between those. And I think if we look at the course of the season and how they were used, McMillan looks quite optimistic. But he has the narrative, that we have Chris Godwin back in town, which is going to make that share a little bit interesting. That's why I would put Mike Evans into that could fall away category. And then when we look at Pearsall, obviously the situations in the off season comes back in, but people are going to remember, people may not remember, because if your fantasy season was over or your team, was nuked at that point, like, you're into the fantasy playoffs. He goes 10 targets, 8 receptions, 141 and a touchdown. He has over 200 yards, 2 touchdowns, 18 targets, and 14 receptions in those last 2 weeks. I know people who, he was the reason that they, won best ball championships in the previous 12 months. So I think he is quite interesting there as we look into it. An older prospect, obviously, as well, 24 years old, because I'm looking here at the player that I'm going to pitch out, and we kind of talked down Josh Jacobs already, and I'm going to go on the opposite side of that and talk up Jayden Reed. I think the Packers lost their identity throughout the course of last season, and you have a quarterback who you feel like ending the 2022 season, you get the win in Dallas in the playoffs. It looks like this offense is taking the step forward under Jordan Love. You give him the contract, then you sign a veteran running back in Jacobs, and you move away from it. And I felt like they really kind of lost their offensive passing identity completely. They had, Tucker Kraft broke out for a few games, but then they even faded away from that. But I think it's going to be interesting. And if it doesn't happen this year, I think it's going to be a case that the team tells you that he's not the guy. But Jayden Reed, for what he was able to show in 2023, I still have a lot of faith in him making that jump back this season. I don't necessarily think people would be giving up on him as we move into this season, but he is wide receiver 40. He's right in that range. He's the next wide receiver going with Ricky Pearsall. He's going after Jacoby Myers and Khalil Shakir, after Juwan Jennings and Deebo Samuel. So I think that he, entering year 3, there's the chance to ascend. When I look at these boards and see where players are going, I'm kind of instinctively looking at like rookies, second-year players and third-year players, and like they're getting a little bit of a green mark on them versus all the veterans that'll be going in that range. And he's going in a range where there's a lot of veterans who may be on the tail end of the career in terms of their production. So I think he's quite interesting. Are you willing to give, or was Reed somebody you gave a shot to originally? Is he somebody you're willing to give another chance to here this season?
Yeah, I mean, this is another one where the fantasy football community all in on Jayden Reed after that rookie season. Maybe not so much reflected in the ADP. There was Christian Watson people versus Jayden Reed people. I know you and Sean often spoke very positively about Jayden Reed. Like Jayden Reed, it made no sense that LaFleur wouldn't give him this expanded role. We also saw the Brazil game where Reed goes nuts to open the year. It looks like everybody's got the league winner. It's just the usage has been so sporadic. I worry that this is a LaFleur thing. I do like the idea that they're self-scouting, looking to get him those manufactured touches that we saw in year 1 when Aaron Jones went down, and they just went to let's get Jayden Reed the ball a lot, and it worked very, very well. He had a ton of touchdown scores. So I think he is a very interesting player in year 3. They could add a wide receiver in round 1. I don't think that's out of the cards. But I think Jayden Reed, at least having a little bit more consistent usage, and if he plays a higher percentage of snaps, that makes sense when we look at the roster. And it would bode very, very well for him at this price tag. Really cheap. I mean, wide receiver 48 in this ADP I'm looking at. I'll say right around him, Josh Downs is interesting too, to me, Colm, because when we look at, it's the same argument. We're chasing a wide receiver 1 on the team, and we're not having to pay even wide receiver 3 prices. In fact, we're paying low-end wide receiver 4 prices. Downs.
Can we get Joe Flacco back at quarterback? No.
I mean, Daniel Jones would not be the worst possible outcome for him with the low ADOT looks, and Downs also his explosiveness out of the slot. But this is a guy that projects to be a potentially high-end target earner if they do go to Daniel Jones. I think we'd actually see a course correction with his ADP if Jones is able to beat Anthony Richardson. And I think that there's a lot of people internally in Indianapolis who want Jones to win it out. A lot of the front office speak, the coach speak indicates it's going to be he's going to give every opportunity to beat out Anthony Richardson. So I think Downs is priced appropriately.
Yeah, well, and if Jones comes in, and I know a lot of people won't be big fans of Jones as an overall NFL player, but in terms of what he can do for the wide receivers versus Anthony Richardson, I think there's quite a step up there. I made the joke about Joe Flacco, but you just need somebody who's capable of and Daniel Jones at times isn't capable of moving the offense, but you need to get somebody in there who's going to take some of those chances. And Downs, a lot of talent. The thing holding him at his ADP is the outlook at the quarterback position, if it's Richardson for the entire season. I have a couple of ones I'm just going to try out here. You did mention you thought Jaylen Waddle might take a bounce back. He's wide receiver 33. He's not a second or third year player at this point, but I've stuck with him the entire time through his career. I think this is the first year where I feel like I'm going to be in that. It's hard to be out a year too early on a player who has failed to be consistent, but he is still wide receiver 33 in the mid-6th round, going next to Jordan Addison. You still holding out some hope there?
I mean, I am. I think when we look at Jaylen Waddle, it's a player that's won in multiple ways. Year one was a high-end target earner, had 100 catches. Year two took on that really high-level yards per reception role, was the explosive play guy. So we've seen him have success multiple ways. We also saw 3 straight years of 1,000 receiving yards. Then Miami pays him. And this year was the year of struggles. I would bet on a Jaylen Waddle bounce back. I think it also is, it also combines well with my Tyreek Hill outlook. If Tyreek Hill regresses further, or if he sort of stays where he was last year, how can the team not embrace a little bit more Jaylen Waddle? Also, it's Mike McDaniel and Tua Tagovailoa, the quarterback and the head coach that Waddle had immense success with. So there's a lot of factors there, including the commitment from the organization to him, that indicate to me that Jaylen Waddle has a real chance to bounce back. Also, with what they did at the wide receiver 3 spot, they brought in Nick Westbrook-Akine, which is certainly not a player that I think is going to threaten Waddle in any way. Certainly going to help Miami as a team in the red zone, but not a guy that could sap targets away from Waddle, was never a high-end target earner. So I think for me, Waddle's just it's a cheap bet right now on him regaining some value. This was a guy that was unbelievably priced in terms of dynasty a few years ago, and now has fallen like a rock. Same thing with the ADP in best ball.
Yeah, he was a 3rd round pick last year, and I was drafting him at that price. He is now down, as I mentioned, to the 6th round. And if you're drafting a hero RB or a 0 RB team, and he ends up being your wide receiver 4 at that point, I do think it makes a very interesting build. As I mentioned, going next to Jordan Addison just after Courtland Sutton and Chris Olave. Then when we get to the last player I want to mention, 2nd year player Marvin Harrison was going at the 1-2 turn last year. Now wide receiver 18 in the 4th round. We obviously seen what Neighbors did last year, and there was some conversation for people, which was the wide receiver 1 last year. That conversation has been absolutely put to bed at quite early, probably in the season. But when we look now, we have Malik Neighbors going as the 8th pick, and then we have mid 4th round Marvin Harrison. Were you in on Harrison last year, and then are you thinking there's a potential still for him? I wasn't really in at the ADP last year, and I was incredibly disappointed by the overall performance. And with the ascension, obviously, of Trey McBride and then him getting paid over the last week, I'm looking at Trey McBride as the wide receiver 1 in this offense.
I absolutely on Trey McBride, and the contract they just paid Trey McBride. I think the potential for Trey McBride to even take on, the argument against McBride right now is his role was just so massive. But he's also has the room to run in terms of positive touchdown regression.
He's the opposite of James Cook. James Cook is going to probably regress back down to the mean, whereas Trey McBride, if he gets back to somewhat of a league average for the amount of targets, he had the same as Brock Bowers. We might get him 6 or 7 touchdowns, and then that covers up a lot of those, short targets that we're getting.
Yeah, and when we talk about Marvin Harrison Jr., I was certainly higher on him than the production indicated. I was very, very high on Malik Neighbors. For me, both those guys were super intriguing. I kind of covered my bases with neighbors, so I would always lump them together and say Neighbors is going to finish as a wide receiver 1. But I did have hope that Marvin Harrison Jr. would give us wide receiver 1 numbers. And thankfully, the ADP for him was just so steamed up that I saved myself there, because there were, in like FFPC main events, you didn't usually get access to Marvin Harrison Jr. like mid-second. He was going at the 1-2 turn, early second, 1-2 turn. So I really didn't have too much exposure to him at all. I've actually moved off of him a little bit in Dynasty to kind of cover my bases. I had one move where I moved a Marvin Harrison plus to get a Brian Thomas Jr. There's been other moves like that where I just want to have some exposure, but I want to make it safer on myself, because I think there's a chance that this is about what he is, wide receiver 18, which is perfectly fine, but it's not what we were expecting for fantasy football. A lot of cardio out there, a lot of routes that didn't really amplify what he did. He did end the season well. The usage was better to end the year. I think the ADP is about right here, Colm, because I think that when the argument with Marvin Harrison Jr. is he could end up catching a bunch of touchdown passes. He does have that in his profile. He did flash with some spike weeks last year, and maybe he gives you 11, 12 touchdown grabs in sort of that big play number 2 target role. I think that the usage will be a little bit more consistent. I think organizationally they have to get there. The idea that guys like Greg Dortch and stuff like that would sap away targets from him, I think that's sort of gone. But I do think that he's a difficult one for me to select there, thinking that I'm going to get wide receiver 6 numbers, something like that from him. I think it's appropriate pricing for a player with his profile. I'd say I'm somewhat optimistic, not overly optimistic.
So that is where we're going to finish up on this edition. If you haven't had a chance to listen to the first show that we recorded earlier this week, we did talk a little bit more about the NFL draft. We talk about Breece Hall and his potential landing spot. There's a lot of fun conversation in there, but it's been awesome to have Theo on. As I mentioned on the previous show, you can check him out on Twitter at the OG Fantasy. He's also over at Fantasy Points as their lead fantasy analyst. As we get ready to close out, Theo, let the listeners know what they can check out over at Fantasy Points.
Yeah, check out Fantasy Football Daily. I'm dropping a bunch of podcasts a week there. Dynasty Life came over from Player Profiler with me. I'm happy to announce that's going to be on Fantasy Points as well. And then School of Scott with Scott Barrett. You just heard Scott with Colm. Scott's awesome. Scott and I are dropping about an episode a week there. All my articles, all my Dynasty rankings are at Fantasy Points. And yeah, this was awesome, though. I really, really enjoyed our conversations, Colm.
So that is going to finish up the second edition. Do go back and check out the first one. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast feed. I have more guests coming. I have Rich Rebar coming on next week, and we have lots more in the pipeline of guests coming on to the RotoViz Fantasy Football show. So subscribe to that feed as well. You'll get the shows once they are available. And until we are back, have a good one.